Hello, I'm International Master Andrew Martin, and I'd like to welcome you to this Foxy Openings DVD on the Sicilian can. Aggressive, yet solid and reliable, the can is one of the easiest and most rewarding Sicilian defences to play, and ideal for the club player. So join with me now as we begin our investigation. Okay, time now to run over some of the main ideas and themes running through the Sicilian can, certainly at the outset. And we'll just take you through the basic moves, where white plays knight takes d4 and black plays a6. The main virtue of black's opening play is the elasticity of the black position. Black doesn't commit himself to any particular configuration or piece placement. There are several ways that black can develop his pieces. The hallmark of the Sicilian can is adaptability. Basically, black is adapting to what white is doing, and he's keeping as elastic a position as he can whilst he does so. For instance, white's main moves in this position are, in order, knight c3, bishop d3, and finally c4. And black has different ways of adapting to each. Against c4, I'm going to recommend that black continue with the flexible knight f6 and then queen c7. In particular here, black is retaining options with his d-pawn, and he's keeping the diagonal of the king's bishop open. These are major trumps in black's hand. Black may play d6 or d5 in one go. He may play his bishop to e7. He may play it to b4. It depends what white is doing. At any rate, this is the most flexible way for black to proceed. Going back to the position after a6, after knight c3, I'm going to recommend black proceed with the very aggressive move b5. This is an option black doesn't normally have in the Sicilian at this early stage, and it's an option which I think will intimidate a lot of white players. Going back to a6 after bishop d3, I'm going to recommend that black plays the flexible move g6. It's very important here that black keeps these options open with his d-pawn, because we're going to see games where black plays d6. We're going to see games where black plays an early d5. At any rate, here the main idea initially is to station the king's bishop actively on the long diagonal, to play knight e7, and then to think about the move d5, although we'll see other games where black does knight f6 and d6. So flexibility is the watchword as we begin our investigation. Okay, basically the typical Sicilian can position is reached after the following moves. White plays e4, c5, knight f3 east, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now the elastic move a6. And I think this is a very good weapon for club players to adopt, basically because it's played rarely at that level among lesser players. Everybody concentrates on the Najdorf, the Dragon, the Sveshnikov. And in the rush to play these highly theorised openings, you know, the can is forgotten. And it's a perfectly reasonable way for black to play, as we will see. It's my perception that the average club player doesn't really have anything theoretical to show against this line, simply because they encounter it infrequently. You know, they're ready for the other lines, but not this one. And essentially a6 is a kind of very positive waiting move. You know, black is cutting white out of b5. He's preparing the move b5 himself. He doesn't commit himself to any particular piece placements or pawn configurations. So it's as an elastic as a move as you can find here. And usually, you know, 99 times out of 100, white is going to respond with one of three moves. We're going to take a look at knight c3 first, which I believe will be the most common move for the average player to have to face. Then the move which is played most at grandmaster level, bishop to d3. We're going to have to obviously have a very close look at that. And we'll finish off with a glance at the move c4, which if there is a drawback to this particular move order from black's point of view, it has to be that white is able to play a Maroczy bind setup with c4. You're going to have to know how to handle those types of pawn structure when you play the can, where white, you know, delays the development of the knight to c3 and plays c4 instead. That can crop up in the bishop d3 line as well. But first of all, let's tackle the most straightforward move, knight to c3. And against that, I'm going to recommend the very aggressive reply b5. This is black's most ambitious attempt in this particular position. Black's intending to station his bishop on b7 as early as possible and put pressure on white's pawn at e4. That is the basic strategical idea and tactical idea in this position. Among modern grandmasters, the name of Peter Svidler stands out as a regular exponent of this line, and I believe this line will furnish very good results amongst average players who simply don't like, as white, the thought that the initiative is going to be taken away from them right at the start of the game, which is exactly what this ambitious move b5 strives to do. There are plenty of other moves for black in the position after knight c3, but b5 is straightforward and aggressive, and this is exactly what club players need. And the first game we're going to look at is a game between international master Duckstein from Austria and Grandmaster Bent Larsen. This game was played in 1959. Of course, Larsen wasn't a Grandmaster at that time. Instead, he was an ambitious young player rising through the ranks in world chess. And he was quite happy to use a move like b5 because his idea is to basically to put maximum pressure on the opponent with either white or black and strive to win the game by any means possible. And so b5 is ideally suited for a stronger player to put pressure on the weaker player by trying to take the initiative right from the word go. And sure enough, it works in this game because Duckstein responds passively with a3. Now you might look at that move and you would say, well, what an ugly move that is. Isn't that a waste of a move? Well, yes it is, but you know, a lot of your opponents may respond in this manner. They don't know anything concrete about b5. They become very scared about the opponent's activity, and so they try and cut out his primary idea of b4. I think you're going to have to face this move quite often in club chess, and so it's as well to see exactly how Larsen responds. Bishop b7, a natural move. What we could easily transpose to here is a variation of the Sicilian Najdorf, where the move a3 is of zero value. At least that's what black's got to try to prove. And seeing the pressure building against e4 already, Duckstein plays bishop d3. Bishop c5, very ambitious, typical Larsen. I mean, I think a perfectly reasonable move for black in this position, if you don't like bishop c5, which of course is reasonable in itself, is d6. And we're going to get some sort of Scandinavian position or Najdorf position where a3 has no bearing on the position whatsoever. And black's plan after d6 is very straightforward. He's just going to go knight d7, he'll go knight f6, he'll go bishop e7, he'll go rook c8. All very normal Sicilian moves with pressure on the c file and against e4. And, you know, black is basically going into a normal Sicilian position with the move a3 thrown in, which can't be that great for white. But Larsen's move is entirely consistent with his style of the day. He was going after players. He felt very confident. It's a very confident move, bishop c5, a most unusual placement for the bishop in the Sicilian. He sees that the knight on d4 is unprotected, so he hits the knight and gives white plenty to think about. That's the way to win games. And sure enough, Duckstein goes on to the defensive. He defends his knight. Larsen hits the knight one more time, and now white has to go backwards with knight ce2. That can't be good, but okay, white can still maintain equality in this position if he's careful. However, in order to do this, he's got to head into a position which is not especially easy to play. And you'll see what I mean after e5, knight f5, g6. Now, by far the most modest way to play this position is simply to take on c5 and go knight e3. Of course, black is very reasonably placed after knight f6 in this position. Black has a very good game. I mean, he's hitting e4. He's got a beautifully placed queen. He can castle, then he can look to play d5. Black has the normal Sicilian trumps in this position. However, that would probably have been the best way for white to play, because at least here he doesn't compromise his pawn structure. Going back to the game, Duckstein decides to play b4 and regrets that move the whole game through. In fact, this game is a story of white overextending with his pawns in order not to try and win the game, but to just try and keep some sort of parity in the position. And, well, I mean, b4 can't be good. The open c file was a typical avenue for black in the Sicilian. What all white's done when he plays b4 is to assist black's counterplay on the c file. And you'll see exactly what I mean as we go through this game. Anyway, there's a capture on e3. Black brings out his knight, hitting e4. White defends the knight. Black plays d6. Castles, castles. Queen f3. Knight bd7. And now it's time to summarise the opening. And, well, it's gone very well for Black. You know, Black's central pawns marry very well with his bishop on b7. Black's next moves will certainly include rook c8, putting pressure along the c file. e4 is certainly something for White to worry about. The c4 square is something for White to worry about. The only square in the Black camp I'm slightly concerned about is d5. If a White knight could hop into d5 and not be removed, then White might be getting himself back into the game. And that's exactly what Dukstein tries to do with g4. It looks like a crazy move, opening up the king. But the fact is, White's going to go g5, then he's going to put the knight on d5. So it's this type of move which White has to play if he wants to maintain some sort of equality in the position. But again, g4 is a move Dukstein comes to regret. Not sure, however, with rook c8 coming up, exactly what White should have played. I really don't see it. I mean, if he puts a knight in on d5 straight away, for instance, well, Black can take that and take once more, and then just simply play f5. And White's got all the same problems that he had before, and e4 is a threat as well. So this will be most uncomfortable for White. Therefore, this is why he goes g4. Okay, rook c8, good move, hitting c3, interrupting White's plan. Dukstein goes backwards, and now a move which is really typical Larsen of the day, I should say. d5, an ambitious pawn sacrifice, not a pawn sacrifice which when White takes, Black's going to get that pawn back straight away. No, Black's idea is to open up the game and to try to take advantage of the loose White king. Please note, if you're trying to assess the position, what sort of compensation does Black have for his pawn, please note the two active Black rooks, whereas White's rooks haven't yet come into the game. So Black has plenty of compensation for his pawn, more than enough. He's got pressure all over the position, and White's got very loose pawns. So, and a tough defence. Nobody likes defending, and as you'll see, Dukstein isn't really up to the job as we go through this game. Well, Queen comes to d4. Black was hitting d5, so White is forced into this uncomfortable move, bishop e4. And now Black played h6. When I first saw this game, I thought rook c3 was the most natural move. But after that, I think rook fd1 saves the day for White. And when the Queen retreats, let's say to b6, White can continue with g5. This would be a variation where White's striking back, not something that Black would want. And so Larsen takes a little bit of time out to stop the move g5 and encourages White to play a further weakening move h4, which is exactly what Dukstein did. I should stress once again that these pawn moves by White can't be taken back. They are very good in the sense that they're fighting to keep the initiative alive from White's point of view, but they're very bad in the sense that, you know, White's king position is becoming severely weakened, and as you'll see, Black is able to take advantage of that as the game progresses. First of all, though, he hops into the active square c3, and White plays rook fd1. That move, rook c3, was tactically well founded, because if White goes in for the fork, Black can take on e4 with the Queen, and White loses material. So rook fd1, hitting the Queen, Queen b6, and now Dukstein's next move tells me that he's not very happy with his position. King to g2. I think that is a definite mistake, and the reason it's a mistake, it's a naive move. It strays onto the same diagonal as the Black bishop. Now Black might not be able to take advantage of that for quite some time, but the fact is such a move is horrendously risky, and well, probably more sensible was Queen e2, and just try to get one of the active Black pieces off the board, planning rook to d3, just getting the Queen off the long diagonal. That would have been a more cautious way to play the position, and infinitely preferable to King g2. But it's pressure all the way from Larsen that is provoking these mistakes out of Dukstein. And now Queen d8 is another excellent move, eyeing h4. Rook d2. Okay, if white goes g forward, g5, lurching forward, black simply takes and goes knight h7. And the pawn on g5 is falling, so white shouldn't do that. Therefore, rook d2. Knight comes to b6. Rook a d1. And then knight comes into c4. Rook to d3. For an instant, it looks as though white is conducting a successful reorganisation. But black continues to hammer away with active moves. And it's not the extra pawn, really, that counts in this position. It's the initiative and the looseness of white's king. At every stage, white's king position is hampering him from going forward in this position. And now I suppose black's simply threatening to take on e4 and take on d5. White plays a sensible move, queen e2, vacating the long diagonal. But now another very good move by Larsen, rook to d4. f3. Okay, white can take on d4. Black recaptures, and now suddenly there are weaknesses appearing all over the white camp. So f3 was played, trying to shore up the position. But now bishop takes d5. And finally, black regains his pawn. A full 12 moves after sacrificing the pawn. It's this type of long-term vision that separates the grandmaster from the average player. And it's a long-term vision which Larsen, even at that stage, at early stage in his chess career, was showing why he was going to become one of the world's top players. So bishop takes d5. White's not even material ahead for his lousy position here. He takes back with the pawn on e4. Of course, if he takes back with the knight, then knight d5 is exceptionally strong, with a fork on f4 very much in the offing. White doesn't like that. Black takes on d3. This is essentially a normal position where white's just hamstrung by his weak king. And now queen c8. Another excellent move. The queen radiates power. She's hitting g4. She's hitting c2. h5. Again, very much lurching forward, but what else was white to play? If he goes king h3, protecting the pawn, h5 is a complete wipeout. Going back, if he plays g5, we just go through with the traditional mechanism, takes in knight h7, and once again, white's position disintegrates. So h5, the writing's on the wall for white now, of course. Black takes on g4. White tries to worry black with rook d6. Easily defended. Queen to d3. Perhaps some problems on the 7th rank. Easily defended. And now white is left with nothing left. And in fact, black is able at the end of this game to conduct a nice little tactical operation, starting with the move queen takes c2 check. A lovely move based on a forking combination. I mean, what is white to do? The fact remains now he's 2 pawns down. The queens are coming off. There's really nothing to say anymore. It's just a matter of wiping up for black, because white has no targets in the enemy camp. And in fact, Larsen is able to pull off another little tactical operation with rook e6, another beautiful little forking combination, you know, elegant in its own way. White goes rook d7. If he takes on e6, knight d4 check comes to a knight ending, where white is 2 connected pass pawns down. So rook d7, king f6, knight f1, h5, and once those pawns on the king side start rolling, then well, really that is that. So white resigned. A nice game in all its phases by Larsen, very instructive, and it just shows you the energetic way black can pursue the initiative in this line if white goes passive right at the outset. Of course, a3 is not the world's best move, but please remember, you're not going to get best moves at club level. What you're going to get is an attempt by the opponent to either throw you off balance or to cope with the unusual problems that you are posing with the move b5. So a3 will be more common than you think. Well, my next example deals with the move I think is best for white when black plays an early b5, and that's bishop d3. And I'm going to show you a game from a tournament in Beijing in 2008 between somebody called Ruan, graded 2496, and Vasilyevich, graded 2354. And we quickly reach the basic position after b5, and now white plays bishop d3. I think this is white's best move. However, I think also that black has very adequate ways to deal with this move. White wastes no time with moves like a3. He or she protects e4, so white is taking action against black's plan of bishop b7. And white doesn't really reveal his hand. Is he going to cast on the queen side? Will he go bishop e3, queen e2, f4? Will he cast on the king side? Will he play with a4? We don't know yet. So it's my contention that black should keep the game as elastic as he can, and thus the move d6 fits the bill. And the point of this move is not to commit the bishop to b7 early. And we'll see in the upcoming game that Vasiljevic makes very good use of this elasticity. For instance, he puts the queen on b7 in this game, and therefore d6 I think is a pretty accurate move order. And left to his own devices, black's planning this position, and it's one at club level which your opponents are going to allow you to get a very comfortable game with, is simply knight out to f6. The bishop comes to e7. Black's knight on b8 goes to d7, then perhaps even to c5, maybe to b6 and into c4. The bishop comes to b7. And there are two real ideas. Black plays against e4 in traditional style for this variation, or he plays on the c file, or on the queen side, again with the typical Sicilian play. So white's got to find some way of interrupting this easy to play development scheme by black. Well, the usual move is castles, and now Vasiljevic played knight f6, and white got to grips with the black pawn formation by playing a4. The other attacking plan is to try and get f4 in, and this was seen in the game Savikas versus Stephenson, played in also October 2008. In that game, queen e2, bishop b7 was played, and now white got on with the business of preparing f4. Black just moves out his pieces in easy style, and now white goes f4. There's a question of how black deals with this scheme, and you will get this scheme a lot when you play this line. Well, Stephenson played b4, which I believe to be a good move. He could have delayed that one more time by playing queen c7. That's another typical Sicilian ploy, covering e5. I suppose after rook a1, in view of the threat of e5, black probably has to go b4 now. And we simply get an unclear position. Let's just take a look at the game Savikas Stephenson, because it does turn out quite well for black. b4 was played, white went knight d1, and now black moves in to attack the e4 pawn. That's a sharp move because, you know, black is cognizant of the fact that the b4 pawn is on pre. However, he's going to answer that move with queen to b6. I think if white ever takes on b4, the queen will come out to b6, and then black will be in good shape. So white went knight f2 in the game, just dropping back. If white goes e5, I think the knight comes into e4, and then if bishop takes b4, queen to b6. And the white position is very, very loose here. I don't really like white's game at all. For instance, if he goes with a move like c3, black takes on d3, then he takes on e5, and you can see the problems looming for white. White's got weaknesses all over the place, and black's position is just very, very active. So that's why, going back to the game, white plays knight f2 and rejects immediate complications for the time being. But now Stephenson comes through with a typical Sicilian freeing thrust, pawn up to d5, and that move actually liberates the black position completely. Knight comes into e4, another good move. Now if white takes on e4, black recaptures, and suddenly there are two white pieces attacked, so white can't do that. He went bishop e3, g6 was played, holding up the pawns on the king side. Rook fd1, queen c7, rook ac1, bishop e7. I'll just take you to the point where I think more or less the opening ends and the middle game begins, and that's right now, where both sides have castled. And black has a very reasonable Sicilian position. The can move order seems to have talked, and in particular the move b5 and the consequent piece movements after that, they seem to have talked white out of the normal active Sicilian attacking plan. In the Sicilian, white normally gets best results if he goes for it. If he plays at all half-heartedly, he tends to allow black into the game. And the typical Sicilian trumps of an elastic pawn formation, an excellent reactive setup, the flexible play on the c-file that black normally gets, and possibly on the a8 to h1 diagonal. All these features are coming into play in this position, where white has been talked into playing slightly too passively. And basically black has a very reasonable position here. In fact, Stephenson went on to win this game. So let's go back to the move. Let's go back to Ruan versus Vasiljevic now, and we'll pick up on the move a4. Along with f4, this is white's most typical disruptive plan, but black finds a very good method to meet it. b4, and now the queen comes out to b6. This looks like a very risky move because it encourages white to play bishop e3, but black's idea is to drop the queen back to b7. And this is a very good reason for playing d6 on move 6. This is why black plays in this elastic style, retaining the b7 square for the queen. Obviously, white's now got to consider the fact that white, the pawn on e4 is attacked. So f3 was played by Ruan, and now just bishop e7, queen d2, and now e5. Another good reason for leaving that bishop on c8, because now, of course, if white goes knight f5, black's going to take it and then go d5 with an excellent centre. So going back to the game, Ruan decided to play knight b3. Alright, possibly knight a5 was worrying, so black develops the knight to c6, bishop c4, and black neutralises the bishop with bishop e6. Bishop d5, pawn up to a5, rook fd1, and after castles it's again time to summarise the results of this opening. Well, it has to be said that this is a complex position. I think black is very reasonably placed, mainly due to the passive position of white's queenside pieces. This is not a normal Sicilian type of game where white has been allowed an automatic attack against the black king. I should emphasise that if white doesn't get this type of attack in the Sicilian, black tends to get a very reasonable game. All of black's pieces are reasonably placed. He has ideas of getting the rooks into the game. There's also the interesting idea of getting rid of the bad bishop by means of bishop d8 and bishop b6. And you begin to wonder about the fate of this knight on a2. What is white going to do with it? And so Ruan decides to take note of this feature of the position and get this knight back into the game. But black is able to maintain a very good position by taking on d5, creating a dead point there, making sure a white knight can't come into d5. And although knight b8 looks very passive, in fact it's the introduction to an aggressive plan. Black is threatening to reintroduce this knight into the game via d7, and then maybe the knight can think about new vistas on b6 or c5. So not at all unreasonable to put the knight on b8 here. c4, white's worried about his d5 pawn. It's true that pawn could be weakened. I mean, it's artificially isolated by black's pawn on b4, so white decides to try to defend it. But of course this allows b takes c3. And now, well, again, you start to like black's queenside counterplay in this position on the c file, on the b file, Okay, white might not be that badly placed, but certainly this is a very comfortable position for black, who continues in confident style, getting rid of his bad bishop by putting it on b6. Rook b1. Some tactics on the b file? Well, black can't see any, and just develops the knight comfortably to d7. White plays knight d3, and now queen a7. Black is conducting a campaign on the dark squares. c5 is protected one more time, and there's pressure on e3. This prompts white to capture on b6, and black takes back with a knight. And whilst you might have thought over the last few moves, well, what's wrong with white's position? Okay, it looks a little bit loose, but is there anything really wrong? Well, now you see what is wrong. The pawn structure, it favours black substantially. There are threats of discovered checks. There are threats of a4 on a4 and c4, and the whole black position just looks more together. So once again, we're seeing white being pushed into making overextending pawn moves. And c5, well, I just don't think white could see what to do. If he plays king h1, black simply takes on c4. And there's a pawn down the drain for nothing. So white is lurching forward. Knight b takes d5. Still problems on the diagonal. And now black completely takes over the initiative with e4. This is one of those games where white will look back, scratch his head and think, well, I didn't do much wrong in this game, but I got completely outplayed. And that is why the Sicilian cannon is such a good weapon. Quite often, white is outplayed and they don't really realise why it's happening. Well, the reason why it's happening is that, you know, white is not able to play this line like a normal Sicilian variation where you get an aggressive pawn roller. And without this aggressive pawn roller, the white position lacks a little bit of punch. At any rate, it's got to be played in a different manner. And a lot of players simply are not able to readjust. And as here, white goes down the tubes very quickly to a black player who's playing extremely accurately. Now white's queen is overloaded, protecting f4 and c5. Queen c4 was played. And now black just gets on the case. Knight takes, queen takes. Rook comes in behind the passed pawn. The other rook is activated. And now e2. And that is really curtains. There's really nothing to suggest. White resigned. If rook e1, it's very, very simple. Black takes on b1, game over. Going black. If white takes on b8. Black takes a queen. Again, game over. So I think e2 just wins. Alright, well, what are we going to say? Let's summarise bishop d3. Bishop d3 should be met in an elastic manner by d6. And now black is planning to attack e4 by means of knight f6, bishop e7, knight bd7, rook c8, typical Sicilian play. White must play very actively against this plan to stop it or to interrupt it. But it's not clear how he does that. And as you've seen, even very strong players, 2500 players, struggle to cope with the new problems black is posing by that early pawn move. So bishop d3 dangerous, but and has to be respected, but by no means lethal. And black can counter it, as I hope I've shown. My next example is particularly important from the average player's point of view because it shows how black should respond when white plays the English attack against the can setup, that is to say, an early bishop e3. And my next game comes from a French Open tournament in 2008. It's between a graded 1900 with white, Mr. Deboué, and he's playing the international master Mohamed Tessir. And of course white now plays bishop e3. This system, in my view, works very well when the bishop on f8 is blocked in by a pawn at d6. White's intention is to go f3, queen d2, possibly castles on the queen side, but certainly a king side pawn storm, using his g and h pawns. Very dangerous plan, very successful at club level, where black often defends inaccurately. However, this game is particularly instructive because it shows exactly what black should do against this setup. Black has a very adequate way of countering this particular formation. And Tessir sets the plan in motion by playing his bishop out to b7 and his knight out to f6. And black's basic plan in this particular structure is to go b4, nudging the c3 knight out of the centre, and then d5 in one go. Funnily enough, you often see this plan enacted in the main line of the Najdorf for bishop e3, with black one tempo behind, because black has played d6 there, of course. Black often goes through with b4 and d5 there. Kasparov's used that plan on a number of occasions. But here we see the souped up version, where white is actually struggling. You know, this plan by black reveals the white formation as rather slow. So, well, white can see that pressure mounting against e4, so he plays bishop d3, queen c7, queen d2, and now goes straight through with the plan. Bishop b4, knight ce2, and now d5. And I think this completely diffuses the entire white setup. Well, what is white to do? I mean, he can't leave the situation as it is, because otherwise black will take on e4 and give white an isolated pawn. He could take, knight takes. This doesn't look very promising for white either. The black pieces are streaming out. White can hardly let black have the bishop, and then I guess black goes knight d7 with a very, very reasonable position. It is noticeable white kingside pawn storm is nowhere to be seen. Just going back to bishop f2, there was a nice little alternative there in bishop d6, and well, black is well placed here. So going back to d5, Deboué tries the tricky e5, and the point of this move is if the black takes on e5 with the queen, then there are going to be some significant tactical complications to overcome after bishop f4. So Tessier correctly drops back with knight fd7, and he starts to pick up a very nice French looking position after f4, knight b6. Now there's a definite threat of knight c4, so white has to take time out to protect that square. And after b3, new weaknesses appear, notably the square on c3, the pawn on c2. Any thought white might have had of launching that kingside pawn storm has been diffused. Now it's a different type of game. g6, very careful, holding up the white kingside pawn advances. And white's got nothing better than to switch plans completely and castle. And now black just gets his pieces out. The knight comes up to a very nice square at c5. Alright, queen f2, knight bd7, rook a c1, h5. Very ambitious. But Tessier's plan in this position is to nudge that knight on g3 out of the way, and then to hop into e4 with his own knight on c5. Another very typical device for this particular setup. h4. Well, that was a pretty desperate move, but it's hard to see what white is going to do. Firstly, it should be noted that the pawn on c2 is really holding white's position together. What white would like to have done, of course, is to play c3, but then the bishop on d3 is hanging. And there's nothing clear for white. I mean, if he comes through with the move f5 in this position, it all looks very ambitious. Black just takes, and is white really going to sacrifice a piece in this position? I don't really believe it. I mean, he can go for it. Knight takes e5, e takes f5, queen takes f5. Well, black can just take that pawn, and there's really not a lot in this position for white. So white decides, reluctantly I suppose, to play h4, and now black gets on the case, forcing further weaknesses on the king side with bishop e7, knight e2, queen d8, g3 comes, and now rook to c8. Planning, for instance, king f8 to g7, maybe the knight comes into e4. And seeing all this, white takes a view. He looks at his position, he thinks, well, if the game goes on, in neutral fashion, I'm just going to lose this, because it's getting worse and worse and worse. So I think Deboué makes a correct decision now, electing to sacrifice a piece. And this messes the game up so much that it forces a slight mistake out of Tessier, which is, of course, the absolutely 100% correct approach in a position of this type. When you're worse, create complications. I mean, that is the rule in chess. So I think knight takes is absolutely right, and black takes back with the knight. Of course, if he takes back with the pawn in this position, then bishop takes g6 check is serious attacking chances for white. So knight takes e6 was played. White comes on with f5, g takes f5, queen takes f5, and now I think black makes a misjudgment. Of course, if he plays rook f8, bishop h6 is good. But I think what black should do in this position is try and clear the decks by playing knight dc5. This is more active than what he actually does. First of all, the king is given room on d7 to move, and the f8 square is kept vacant for maybe a queen or rook or something. And this forces white's hand, because, queen g8 may be a threat, rook f8 is certainly a threat. So white's got to continue with forcing play. And the only way to do this is to take on c5, which is a concession in itself, and then play bishop f5. But after that, black saves the day now with queen b6. And, well, there are some nasty threats of discovered check in this position. So if white liquidates with bishop takes, queen takes, queen takes, king takes, and then gives a check, black can crawl away with king to d7. Anyway, I think that's what black should have done. Instead, he goes knight df8, and now the white attack starts to assume relatively serious proportions. Queen takes f7, king d7, and now what white should play, of course, is bishop f5, with considerable attacking chances. As you can see, there's no queen b6 available, and white's idea of knight f4 or knight d4 is certainly very dangerous. However, white goes knight d4, allowing a liquidation. Knight comes into e6, and the obvious idea that white wanted to play here was queen takes e6 check. Okay, king takes e6, bishop f5. Who could resist this temptation? King f7, bishop takes c8 check, king g6, bishop takes b7. And suddenly we've got a new game on our hands. You know, white has rook and bishop, a couple of pawns for the queen. Black's king seems to be out in the open, but for the time being, the bishop on b7 is offside. This gives black the chance to play queen to d7, gaining a little bit of time back after queen g4. Now white's got to worry about his own king. Bishop comes to d3 check, king g7, and white's got to take a little bit of time out now to go bishop f2. Black went bishop takes h4, king g2, and now the rook came to f8. Possibly this was a move prompted by time trouble, I don't know, but if black wanted a sensible alternative, I think bishop g5 very much fits the bill, with ideas of h4, and there is certain pressure against the white king. However, this has been a complicated game. One can't blame the players for being in time trouble, so black played rook f8. Now he's got vague ideas of rook takes f2 in the wings. White's so scared by that he goes bishop e1. I think what he should play, of course, is rook g1. Then there might be some chances to hang on here. Bishop e1 was played. Rook takes f1. Bishop takes f1. Bishop g5. And now I think it's all getting clearer. Black is suddenly on the rampage with the queen. White's pieces are remarkably uncoordinated considering what they were like 5 or 6 moves ago. And black now comes in and takes the full point with queen e4 check, king g1, and now bishop e3 check. And the point of this move is that if white goes bishop f2, black takes, king takes, queen takes, c2 check. Okay, that was a very up and down, entertaining game. Black won in the end. It could have gone the other way. I mean, you know, knight takes e6 by white was a very ingenious idea. This shouldn't deflect us from the fact bishop e3 is a not especially effective way to meet the can move order. And with bishop b7 and then knight f6, intending b4 and d5, black will certainly get a very good position, and a very active one to boot. Let's move on now to consider what seems to be a very economical and logical option for white. That is to say, when black plays b5, white goes g3, simply intending bishop g2, castles on the king side, and then white will take a look around and see where he wants to go. Indeed, it's this approach which has found favour with many strong players. It looks a very solid way to continue, it looks a very consistent way to continue, and black must respond accurately against it. In my view, by far the best way for black is to play aggressively. He should first of all play bishop b7, and then go with the immediate b4. And I'm going to use the game Brynel versus Hansen, Kurt Hansen, Grandmaster from Denmark, played in Reykjavik 2000, to illustrate my main points. Well, b4 nudges the knight away from the defence of e4. That's the main point, so that black can gain time with knight f6. After b4, white's options are limited. He's got 3 squares for the knight. In the game Brynel versus Hansen, white went knight a4. We'll look at that in a moment. But let's just drop back and examine the alternatives. In the game Tokmina versus Lastin, Rovno 2000, black had to face knight ce2. After every retreat or move of the knight, black is going knight f6, intensifying the pressure against e4. f4. And on this particular day, white chose queen d3 to defend. Well, when the queen comes up to d3, from where I'm sitting, that looks like a target for black to hit with the knight on b8. And so black went busily about his task, developing that knight so as to gain time on the queen. And I think already black has a satisfactory position. It's quite surprising how disruptive the move b4 actually is to white. And white's got to do a little bit of reorganisation. As I've made the point so many times on this DVD, it's not quite a normal Sicilian. You know, there are various things about the position which are different. For instance, white's piece placement is slightly more passive than it would otherwise be in normal Sicilian. And white's got to do a little bit of readjusting. Meanwhile, black brings his pieces onto good squares, and the rook comes to c8. I presume black's plan now is simply queen c7 when the pressure is building on c2. Alright, white went c3 to break the pressure, and now black hit back in the centre with d5. We see this commonly in the variation, and now pressure is brought to bear against e4. Okay, white took it, and black took back with a knight. White went f4, opening up his bishop, and black went knight c5, with a very satisfactory and active game. Back now to b4, and knight b1 is another possibility. Looks silly, but, you know, the knight wasn't doing anything on e2. And as we'll see in our game Brynel versus Hansen, a4 is a less than impressive square. So knight b1 is not as silly as it looks. However, it does give black the chance to gain a little bit of time with knight f6. Alright, knight d2. And now in the game Arizmendi Martinez versus Vehi Bach Palencia, 1999. Black just went straight through with d5. And I believe this to be a straightforward approach and very satisfactory. After e5, knight fd7, knight 2 to f3, queen c7, bishop f4, bishop c5, castles, knight c6. Black had a very reasonable position, similar to a French. Going back to knight d2, if you're looking for alternatives to d5, queen c7 is a very flexible way to play, as happened in the game Nataf versus Ems, London 1994. White castled, and now black went knight c6, exploiting the fact immediately that the knight on d4 was unprotected. White took on c6. I mean, I'm doubtful that those moves can ever give white any sort of advantage. In general, exchanges of this type favour black, because black's got slightly less space. So now basically the black pieces have got more room to move in. White went a3, trying to break out. Black took. White went b3, not wanting to smash up his pawn structure. And now Ems went straight through with d5. Very useful for black to be able to play this move in one go without having played d6 first. And after bishop takes a3, bishop takes a3, rook takes a3, castles. Again, black had the usual very satisfactory position. And his ongoing plan involves bringing his rooks to the centre of the board. So going back to b4, it may well be that white's fianchetto is diffused by this simple move. And, well, on this day, Brynel went knight a4, and again, knight f6 was the logical reply. Well, white castled. Perhaps not a reaction the average club player would be willing to try, because it involves the gambit of a pawn. So let's just go back and see what happens if white plays other moves. Well, white can play queen e2. In the game Gdansky versus Stoll, Germany 2000, black immediately hit with knight c6, seeing that the knight was unprotected on d4. That's a typical response. And that's a little bit awkward for white, this move, because if white takes on c6, black takes back with the bishop, and suddenly the knight on a4 is on pre. So knight b3 was played. Black played d6, white castle, bishop e7, rook d1, queen c7 out of the way, c3, b takes c3, knight takes c3, and black castled with a roughly equal position. Going back to the position after knight f6, white may also play bishop to g5. After that, the game Bistric versus Sachs, Sarajevo 1982, went bishop e7, white castled, and now black went queen a5, forcing white's hand because the bishop on g5 is attacked as well as the knight on a4. So white's got to take. If he has to take in this position, I start to believe black's position. And after bishop takes f6, it was obvious that black had a very satisfactory game. In fact, black went on to win this game in short order. It's very important to see that the move e5 here, opening up fire on the bishop on g2, fails to bishop takes g2, e takes f6, bishop takes f1, f takes g7, and now the simple rook g8. And the point of this is that at the end of the complex line, the knight on a4 is on pre. So, going back one more time to knight f6, I suppose queen d3 is also a move. There I can suggest knight c6, I can suggest queen a5. Black may also consider the move d6 here, very simply, and if castles, knight bd7, trying to make a target out of the white queen. So, black basically has several satisfactory responses if white timidly defends the e-pawn. So Brynel goes for it with a known pawn sacrifice, castles, and Hansen buys the pawn with bishop takes e4, which I believe to be the best move. Okay, white takes, this was all known, and now he goes rook e1, trying to create some action on the e file. Just going back, white may try bishop e3, which eyes up the b6 square. Well, against that, black goes straight through with d5, and if c4 trying to break open the game, black can take en passant, showing just how annoying that pawn is on b4. White recaptures, and now black goes knight d7. As far as I can see, black's a pawn up for very little compensation. So, back to the game and rook e1. Why should black move his knight? He didn't. d5. And now white went for it with knight takes e6, which is probably the correct appraisal of this position. If we just go back, if white doesn't take immediate action and violent action, then he's just going to be a pawn down for nothing. I mean, for instance, the move c4 doesn't impress. Black can take en passant with more or less transposition to the other lines. And if white goes queen f3 here, well, exchange sacrifices on e4 just don't seem to cut the mustard as far as I can see. So Brynel went for it with knight takes e6. And the point of this move is that after f takes e6, white's going queen h5 check. But the fact that white has been forced into this violent action is the noteworthy consequence of black's sharp opening play. I think black survives this position, as you will see. Well, he went g6, and white must lurch on with queen e5. Now comes the excellent move, queen f6, returning material in order to get a good position. This shows a grandmasterly appreciation of the position. Whereas a weaker player might try to hang on to the material where at all possible, the grandmaster returns material at the first moment to get a good game, to get a playable game, to get a nice easy position. This is the practical way to play chess, and it's why these guys are so good. They recognise the right moment to do this. So anyway, black's given back his piece, but in return he's now got the possibility of booting out the rook on e5 with bishop d6 or bishop g7, and then he can get his knight out to c6. The black pieces will flow out. For white, it's not so simple. White's still got this knight on a4 to resolve, and his queen side is undeveloped. So I would say, actually, very surprisingly, black has got the better position here, albeit a very slight advantage, based on ease of development. Alright, well, white does his best for the time being. Bishop comes out to e3, and black should not allow bishop d4. So bishop g7 is logical, and now white brings his rook to the centre. Rook h to c8. Yep, the rook is coming into action on the c-file. Now black has pressure against the queen side, notably c2 and b2. And now white went rook d3. Well, this is a position which is simplified to a certain extent, but it's not that easy to play. Black's pieces are more influential than white. Not only does black have pressure on the queen side, he's also got some interesting thoughts of occupying squares such as c4 and f3. So white has got a difficult defensive task. I mean, maybe Brynel's best move here was bishop d4, trying to neutralise the bishop. And, well, if black doesn't want the bishop exchange, he's got to move his centre forward. Okay, that might not be so bad for him, but the further those pawns come forward, the less easy they are to defend. And so what, of course, white is hoping for is to jab at the pawns with a clever move like f4, and to try to disrupt the black formation. Probably this was black's best try to push the pawns forward, but it was white's best idea too. You know, in the final position here at the end of the line after bishop f2, I think white has maintained some sort of equal chances. It's a sharp position, but white has targets. The black centre is a target for white's pieces. So, the thing about rook d3 is it doesn't really do anything. If we go back to the game, it's kind of a passive solution to the problems of the position. White is just waiting to see what happens. And black is able to improve his position. This is the problem for white. You know, if black couldn't improve his position, then rook d3 would just be a good move, passing the buck. But black's move a5 is good. And as we can see, black is intending to introduce his rook into the game on a8 now, via a6 to c6. And then the pressure on c2 builds. So, black is still a bit better. Pawn up to a3. Black goes through with his plan. White snaps off the pawn and goes b3. Now comes the knight to e5. This was the problem earlier I mentioned. You know, the f3 square is creaking, and well, in order to defend the pawn on c2, white has got to go a bit passive with his rook. Black's play is entirely logical here, building up on c2. And now I think white saw that unfortunately the move rook c1 is failing here to the clever move d4. This is a problem for white. He can't take on d4 because of the fork on f3. If he goes bishop f4, then black has another clever continuation, knight f3 check, and now the crushing move d3. And the point of this move is that after c takes d3, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, knight d4, rook comes to e1, and now knight takes b3, with a much superior endgame for black. White has numerous problems in this position. The d3 pawn is weak. The b4 pawn is potentially a winning passed pawn. Black has control of the only open file. He's got a wonderful bishop. All his pieces are superior to white's pieces, which means a very unpleasant defence. So going back, Brynel knew that he had problems with the c2 pawn, and so elected to jettison that pawn with king f1. But of course now rook takes c2 should be very good for black indeed. Okay, rook d4, fishing in troubled waters. Rook takes e2, simplicity. When ahead on material, there's no need to complicate, just swap the pieces off and try to reconfigure your position optimally. White is just trying to conjure something up when nothing exists, and now black starts to come forward in the centre with e5. As long as white can keep active, then he'll probably have a little bit of compensation. It's black's job to push him back and render him inactive. Alright, rook e3. Bishop d4. Why complicate? Off comes another set of pieces. Now black is probably threatening to penetrate to the second rank with rook c2. So white tries to cover that with king d1. Rook comes up to c6. A clever move, dominating the knight and threatening rook f6 and rook takes f2. g4. White can't think of what to do. We just go back. Well, it's difficult to see a move. If he goes knight b2 in this position, then just simply rook c2. This is the problem for white. He can't find an active move. So he tries g4. Perhaps the idea was g5, keeping the rook out of f6. So that's why the rook comes into f6 straight away. White goes h3, and now black just simply brings up the king. King f7. You know, this is a very easy approach to chess. I mean, I think black could have taken on f2. He was obviously afraid of knight b6 here. But then I think knight f3 is just a good move. And white can't take on d5 in view of rook d2 check. So, probably both of those moves won. King f7 is very simple though. Keeping the knight out of the game really. King comes up. And there we are, king d6. Maximum coordination. This is what black has been striving for. Pawn up still. King c5 on the horizon. Beautiful rook. Lovely knight. The game is over. So a few more moves are played, but really they are completely meaningless because there's nothing for white to do. And now the pawn on e3 is simply touching down. So g3, summarising, is entirely logical. It's solid, but I think black can meet this move very effectively with bishop b7 and b4. pushing the white knight on c3 to a less than satisfactory square. I believe this approach gives black an excellent position in all lines. My final game in this knight c3 b5 section comes from the Gibraltar Masters tournament in 2008. Playing white is Gary Quillen, FIDE master from England. Playing black, the veteran Swedish female grandmaster Pia Kramling, who incidentally has been using the cam for many years with great success. And it's another useful example for us because it features white's best move after b5, bishop d3, which Kramling instructively answers with pawn to d6. We've seen this before. White reinforces e4, so black delays the move bishop b7 for a little while, preferring other more standard moves instead. The main reason is that the bishop b7 is biting on granite as far as e4 is concerned at the moment. So black figures it's better to get on with kingside development, and this is exactly what Kramnik does. Alright, white plays a4. This is the most challenging move. Black pushes on by, white goes knight a2, and now pawn up to e5. And well, basically this is a good variation of the Najdorf, because if the knight hops into f5 now, I think black would simply take it off. Bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and now d5 starts to look very good for black. That's the whole point of this particular move order. So going back to e5, white retreats with knight f3, and black brings her knight out to c6. White improves his bishop to c4, and now black simply gets on with the business of castling. And black has a nice satisfactory game here. The pawn on b4 is like a bone in white's throat. It's preventing white from effectively developing his pieces to their best squares. And in common with a lot of the other lines in this system, white is being forced to think for himself at an early stage. It's not the standard Sicilian, and white cannot launch these pawn avalanche attacks against the black king position in the routine manner he can in other variations. He's just got to think differently. Meanwhile, black can develop in standard fashion. Probably the bishop will come to b7 here, the queen will come to the c file, maybe rook to d8. And, well, black's position looks perfectly satisfactory already. So, Quillen played what at first sight looks like a perfectly reasonable move, bishop d2. It's just a little bit passive. I don't think white knows exactly what to do. He's just seeing pressure mounting against e4, so he takes action against it with rook e1. Queen b6. Fair enough, bishop e3, and the queen drops back to c7. Bishop d5. Pawn up to a5. Queen to c4, pinning, hitting f7, and bishop d8 is a careful move by Kramnik. Bishop g5. Well, when white plays such a move, that's a clear sign to me he's interested only in a draw, because bishop g5 forces lots of exchanges. Just going back though, I wonder if there's anything else white could have done. I think black is simply going to snap off that bishop on d5. So for instance, if white goes through with a move like rook a d1, black will simply take on d5. And if he takes d5, knight e7. Queen takes c7, bishop takes c7, and well, black is very well placed here. If white goes in for the trick move knight takes e5, he finds himself bound by bishop takes d5. So that's just one small example of how the position can blow up in white's face if he tries anything fancy. This is simply a position where perhaps Quillen takes the right view. He's got nothing, so he's got to try and promote some sort of exchanges and try and bail out for a draw. Well, the exchange is actually run in black's favour. Black takes off the very powerful bishop on d5. Now black uncovers an attack on the white queen. White must take on c7. And what actually we get is a type of semi-endgame position where black has two bishops. Okay, the bishop on c7 is not that impressive yet, but it does have some potential. And white has a rather inferior pawn structure. It's easy to see that these pawns on d5 and f3 are less than inspiring. And well, black is basically much better in this position. It's a grim struggle to try and make a draw for Quillen here. Okay, try c4. If black now took on c3, that would conveniently bring the knight back into the game. So of course Kramling has no intention of so doing. Plays f5. Now there's a threat to shut off the bishop with f4. So white has to get out of the way, bishop d2. And black goes f4 anyway, freezing the kingside pawns. Now there is a distinct danger to the white king. Knight c1. Rook f5. It's noticeable that white has absolutely no counterplay in this position. He's just got to sit and watch the black pieces pile up on the white king. Perhaps his only counter chance in this position is associated with the move c5. Well, of course, after that, there are so many weaknesses on the long diagonal that black can have a field day just mopping up white pawns. So white really hasn't got anything to do. Meanwhile, Kramnik mashes her pieces against the king. There's really nothing white can do about this whatsoever. And now it's desperation day. Knight takes f4. Well, there was nothing for it really. White had to do this. E takes f4. Little bit of toing and throwing now. Rook e8, rook f7, and now rook c8 declares Kramling's intention of going on to play for the win. Obviously, rook f7 is leading to an equal game. Rook c8. Now, white has it all to do. Bishop takes f4. Rook f5. Bishop comes back to g3. And now bishop a6. And that gets the bishop off the embarrassing unprotected b7 square. Now I think rook takes d5 is a serious threat. Not sure what Quillen could have done about it. Maybe, Gary Quillen's an habitual time trouble addict, so maybe he was in time trouble at this point. White's position is absolutely desperate, whatever happens. But b3 just hastened the end, really. Rook takes d5. King g2, rook f5. c5, too little, too late. And now bishop d8. And, well, that really is that. There are no moves left for white. Virtually all his pieces are on pre. c5 pawn is attacked. Rook on e7 is attacked. There are no tricks with rook e8 check. I think black would simply go king f7 against that. And so a fairly straightforward win for Kramling there in one of the main lines. Just going back to the opening now for the last time. Summarising, I think b5, and especially at club level, is a very effective way to play for black. It's aggressive, it's straightforward, it gives black a lot of attacking options on the queen side, and in particular, the fact that the bishop on f8 is unobstructed makes it difficult for white to actually put into practice the standard attacking plans in the Sicilian. And in particular, the danger of a kingside pawn roller in this line is minimal. And that's a big bonus as far as I'm concerned when I'm sitting on the black side of this position. So go ahead and play b5. I think it will score extremely well for you. Okay, we're going to take a look now at white's most flexible fifth move. That is to say bishop d3. White makes no commitments yet with either the knight on b1 or the pawn at c2. We don't know yet, as black, whether that pawn is going to go up to c3, c4, or stay where it is. Nor do we know where the knight's headed for on b1. Is it coming to c3 in straightforward fashion, or is it going to go to d2? Is it going to stay there for the time being? Now, it's no secret that bishop d3 is the most common move at grandmaster level. Whether it will be the case at club level, I don't know. But certainly bishop d3 is a move to be respected. And I'm going to recommend that black meet that move with g6, which again is as flexible as a reply as black can find. Black intends to station the bishop actively on g7, much more aggressive on g7 than it is on e7. And black has options with his d-pawn. He can either play for a kind of improved hedgehog position where he's got all his pieces and pawns on the third rank, or he can maybe push that pawn to d5 in one go. That's not out of the question. And break white's position up in that way. All in all, quite an interesting variation, and quite good enough at club level to set the opponent thinking and to give them problems from an early stage. Now, the first game I'm going to show you is a game from Buenos Aires Olympiad 1978, an old game but a relevant game between Grandmaster from Finland Heikki Westerinen and Ulf Andersson, who at that time was, one of the strongest players in the world, a brilliant player and especially good at defending. Alright, white castled in that game, black played bishop g7, and now we see one of the main options white has available to him in this variation, pawn up to c3. But, well, from where I'm sitting, this move looks rather slow. It should be relatively easy for black to achieve a decent position against such moves. And what Anderson does to begin with is just set up some kind of hedgehog position where he develops his king's knight and castles and just awaits events. Well, there are lots of ways white can play this position. Anderson, Westerinen played his knight up to c4. Obviously white could go a4 in this position. I suppose after that black would just maintain a tight line with b6. But after knight c4, Anderson was able to go active with the move e5. Please note that b5 in this position would have been met by knight takes d6. That was the point of Westerinen's last move. And after queen takes e6, e5 with advantage to white. Of course, Anderson understands all these nuances, so he plays e5 first, driving the knight away, and only then does he play b5. And the main point of this move, it's our old friend the pawn at e4, is that if white plays knight e3, black now goes bishop b7, targeting e4 and making it difficult for white to find a good move. I mean, if white has to play f3 in this position, well, black has many reasonable moves. Certainly he can look forward to playing d5 at some point in the near future. Maybe he can even play d5 straight away. Knight bd7 is another reasonable move. At any rate, black is in no danger in this position. So Westerinen decides to go on the trail with knight ca5. And now black plays a good move here. Bishop d7, just preparing knight to c6, which is exactly what Anderson did. Alright, c4. Well, white's trying to break up black's pawn structure. Again, Anderson plays a very good move here, knight into d4. White snaps that off and plays pawn up to h3. Let's just take a look what happens if c takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5. Well, after that, black has rook takes a5. And if bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, bishop takes a5, queen takes a5, and black has the better position. Okay, white's got a rook and pawn for the queen, and he's got two connected pass pawns on the queen side. But black's pawn at d4 is pretty strong, and the black knight is going to find significant employment on either c5 or e5 in this position. So really it's black for choice. Just going back to the position after e takes d4, I mean, maybe white's best move in this position is simply to go b4 and try to make something of his queenside position. But anyway, Westerinen decided to go h3, and now black played rook e8, activating the rook, putting pressure on the pawn at e4. And white moved his queen off the file with queen f3. Okay, queen to b6. Well, in this position, I'm pretty certain that Anderson was thinking about playing b4, jamming up the queenside pawn position, and to a certain extent stranding the knight at a5. For instance, if white plays a move like rook e1 in this position, then I think b4 is a move. If knight b3, then a5. And black is starting to assume a useful initiative. So going back to queen b6, this is why Westerinen plays b4 himself, cutting that option out. And black continues to activate his pieces by playing bishop e6. Now Anderson is thinking about not only attacking c4, but he's got knight d7 in mind, and then maybe knight up to e5. White takes on b5, black recaptures, and now queen comes back to e2, hitting b5. But now another good move by black, bishop f5. Counterplay looms against the pawn at e4. And the first point to note is that if white plays f3, black can go d5. And, well, I think this is just a pretty good move, noting that white can't capture on b5 in this position because of d3 discovered check. So after bishop f5, Westerinen probably thought to himself, well, I've got to capture on b5 in this position, but of course that allows rook takes e4. And now we see that black has significant counterplay. Alright, queen comes up to c4. Rook c8, continuing to activate. And now a very sharp move by white, bishop to c6. In essence, white is a couple of moves away from a winning position. He's got these dangerous passed queenside pawns, and what he'd really like to do is to push them up the board. What black must not allow is the white pawns to arrive at b4, b5 and a4 unchallenged. So this is why Anderson gets on the case immediately with d3. And now we reach the most complex position in the game, where Westerina's basically got to choose where he puts his queen. In the game, he put his queen on c1. Well, we'll take a look at that in a moment. Let's just take a different glance at some of the alternatives for white. For instance, what happens if he plays queen b5? Well, that move releases the pressure just momentarily, and black is able to take advantage of that by capturing on b5 and going rook e2. And if knight b3, threatening to unleash the queenside pawns, then I think rook c2 is a good move. And if rook fd1, knight d5. This short example shows you just how difficult it is for white in this position to neutralise the activity of the black pieces. You know, white hasn't got enough time to push those queenside pawns. The active black pieces are just crawling all over him. So maybe queen b5 going back to d3 isn't good enough. Obviously, bishop takes e4 is a move. And the point of this is that if black now plays rook takes c4, knight takes c4, queen d4, white has bishop takes f5. With what appears to me to be an unclear position. I mean, okay, you could say that after queen takes c4, black has counter chances. Well, there's no doubt that he does. But somehow this position is a mess. It's very unclear. I think instead, going back to bishop takes e4, that black should play knight takes e4 in this position. And now white has some problems with his queen and his bishop. The only move to keep contact with that bishop on d2 is queen takes d3. And now, of course, knight takes f2 is a move. And it all gets very complicated after bishop e3 only move, knight takes d3, bishop takes b6, bishop takes a1, rook takes a1, and now knight takes b4 is possible, but it may be that rook c2 is even stronger. And if b5, for instance, black goes bishop e4 with an excellently coordinated position. I think what we're seeing here is that it's very difficult for white to get those queenside pawns moving. He simply hasn't got the time because the black's pieces are too active. And well, this certainly is the scenario after queen c1, because black played rook e2, white went b5, striving to get his ideal position, knight e4, hitting the bishop on d2, attacking the rook on a1. In order to keep parity, white's got to find active moves himself, so he goes knight c4, and in comes the black queen to d4. And really the white position's hanging by a thread here. You know, it's just a question of time before something falls off. In the game, Westerina played bishop e3, trying to anchor his pieces. If he goes rook b1, d5 continues the policy of disruption. And it seems to me that black is winning material in this position. So, bishop e3, queen takes a1, queen takes a1, bishop takes a1, rook takes a1. And once again, white is looking forward to pushing those queenside pawns. Anderson's right on the ball. d5, another excellent move. And this basically stops white from moving those queenside pawns. Because if, let's say white goes knight b6 in this position, then we have d2, threatening rook e1 check. King f1, possibly forced. Knight c3, another excellent move. Knight takes c8, rook e1 check, rook takes e1, and now the killing Zwischenzug, bishop d3 check. That's a cute variation I have absolutely no doubt that Westerina overlooked. Going back to the game, white played bishop takes d5, d2 again, king f1, knight c3 again, this time with interest, because black's threats now include the bishop on d5 and the pawn at b5. Knight b2 was played, possibly in time trouble, and now the killer blow, rook takes e3. After which, white actually decided to resign this position. The problem for white is that, well, in this current position, he's rook down. If he takes on e3, black simply just plays knight takes d5, And now there are a number of threats. Black threatening rook c1. He's threatening knight takes e3. King e2 doesn't actually defend anything after rook c1. So that was it. A flurry of complications, and Anderson wins the game. So I hope that game gives you an initial idea of the potential of Black's setup with g6. A nice active bishop on g7, gazing towards the white queen side, and the same old scenario in the can. White having to organise his position in a different way to normal in the Sicilian defence, and in this case failing. My second game, featuring 5 bishop d3, comes from the Alushta Summer Open in June 2008. And it's between a guy called Alexei Chos, graded 2406, and he's playing Essam El Gindi, graded 2507. And here we see Black employing the move g6 again. And this time, White goes straight through with c4, declaring his hand to a certain extent. Well, Black plays bishop g7, and White retreats his knight to f3. If bishop e3 in this position, then I think Black can go knight c6. White trades, Black recaptures, and now White has an immediate problem with the pawn at b2. He begins to wish he hadn't moved that bishop on c1. And, well, Black's plan in this position is knight e7 and then d5 as quickly as possible. Something similar happens in the game. With knight f3, we once again see, how independent this Sicilian variation is for Black. It's not like any other. It may seem as though it is, but it's not, because White is being forced to make unusual moves, in this case a retreat as early as move 7 in the game, to try to maintain some sort of advantage in the position. And I think it's unlikely he will be able to do so. Anyway, Black keeps the bishop unobstructed by knight e7 and decides to castle. Both sides bring their pieces out, and White plays bishop f4 in the hope that he's going to be able to put a bishop on d6. This is something you've got to be aware that can happen in this variation if you leave your pawn on d7. In this case, El Gindi has it all worked out, and he goes straight through with the freeing move d5. If you can get this move in this variation, you're doing rather well. White takes on d5, Black recaptures. Now the bishop on c8 can come out into the game, and White pushes on. Of course, if White takes on d5 in this position, it's very hard after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, to imagine that White has any advantage whatsoever. In fact, this is precisely the type of position White should seek to avoid in the Sicilian defence. Essentially, his queenside pawns are much weaker than Black's. The bishop on g7 is fantastic. b2 is on pre immediately. Black's threatening bishop g4, and then simply bringing rooks to the centre. It flows for Black. For White, it's not so easy. So just taking on d5 twice doesn't really solve the problems of the position at all. Therefore, White pushes, but it helps Black to develop his position actively, and bishop g4 was now the reply. Suddenly, the pawn at e5 is under some pressure. That's why White now plays rook e1. Alright, knight to d4. Another excellent move. Again, White's hand's completely forced. He's got to play bishop e2 in this position, otherwise his kingside pawns get ruined, and Black just takes off the bishop. Queen takes, h6. Time to summarise. Well, one more move, and then we'll do a little summary. Okay, h3, bishop e6. Well, Black has equalised fairly comfortably out of the opening. He's got 2 bishops. Yes, he does have an isolated d-pawn, but he's got plenty of active play on the queen side, for instance. And, well, rook ad1 was played, but queen a5 reveals the true state of affairs. This position is roughly balanced, and Black has no reason to complain. He's got some activity on the queen side to look forward to. White played knight d4, respecting the 2 bishops. He felt it was time to regain the 2 bishops and establish some sort of parity in the position. Rook a d8, and White snapped off the bishop. Alright, f takes. Queen to g4, a move that looks more dangerous than it is, because Black is easily able to cover his weaknesses, the one on e6, by playing rook f5. And rook f5 is far more than actually a defensive move in this position, because after bishop g3, rook d f8, Black was actually starting to turn defence into attack, which is the hallmark of the master player. 2 things with 1 move. These guys can combine ideas in chess. once you get to the stage in chess where you can actually start making moves which combine ideas, defence in this case with attack, then you know you're starting to make it. And well, this position, okay, it's very difficult to definitively state that black is better, but I definitely prefer black in this position. He's got active play on the king side, and white doesn't really, as long as he can't put a knight on d4, have anything to set against it. Of course, white's queenside pawns are weak as well and vulnerable to the black queen, so black is definitely for choice in this position. And so it continues. White played king h2, black played king h7, f4, h5. Not sure about that move f4. Possibly that was a little bit impatient. In fact, that pawn on f4 is going to come under some serious fire on the very next move with the help of bishop h6. It might have looked as though that bishop was getting trapped in, but bishop h6 reveals the true state of affairs. In actual fact, it's white that's in serious trouble now. He seems to have misplayed this position. And let's not forget, Alexei Chos is 2400. So if he can misplay it, so can your opponents. Well, you know, I think white is losing a pawn in this position. It really is as simple as that. He tried rook f1. There was a series of exchanges on f4, which didn't really help white's cause at all, because he's just come into some sort of simplified position, a pawn down. White tried rook f1. It's now time to activate the black queen. Okay, white can give the queen a nudge, but he's actually nudging the queen to an even stronger square on d4. And now black is simply threatening to take on f1 and then take on e5, winning a second pawn. So what is white to play? The knight on c3 looks misplaced. The pawn on e5 is weak. Black is just simply winning this position. So the game limped to a finish. White took on f4. No doubt he couldn't quite believe how bad his position had become so quickly. That's the way it sometimes is in a line like this. And after knight c5, knight d4, there was nothing left other than to resign. Well, black is a pawn up. He's got all the pressure. The pawn on e5 is basically a goner. And the white king is coming under fire as well. So all those things combined basically mean that white's position is hopeless. And Chos, rather than be tortured, decided to resign. So another one of those deceptively easy wins for black in this line, and a game which made 5g6 look like a very good move indeed. The third game I'd like to discuss involving the move bishop d3 comes from the European Championships in 2008. Playing white is the Greek Grandmaster Kotronias, playing black the English Grandmaster Nigel Davis, with whom the Can is a firm favourite. He believes it's an elastic and aggressive way to start the game, and he feels it sets the opponent difficult problems in a traditional Sicilian setting. And here we see him employing the move g6. Kotronias castled. Now let's just take that move back and imagine that white thinks this is the dragon and decides to treat this like a Yugoslav attack. For instance, he plays knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, and then continues to develop as if this were a normal Yugoslav attack. Well, of course it's not. That's the first point to be made, because there's a white bishop on d3. That changes things slightly. Okay, well, I'm recommending that black castle in this position. And now we're going to follow the game Berbatov versus Paunovic for a little while, Malaga 2008, to see what would happen if white castles on the queen side. Well, in that game, black played knight c6, bishop came to c4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, b5, bishop b3, and bishop b7. And after this move, black had some counterplay. Going back to the position after f3, I wonder whether knight c6 isn't a more accurate move order. Delaying castles for the time being. At least that would be my recommendation. And the main point of this move is that if white takes on c6 straight away, black recaptures, and after castles, he's ready with a central break d5. In my view, this must give black counterplay. Going back to knight c6, if white castles straight away, black probably has to castle and take the medicine after h4. Probably the best move after that is to go knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and now b5 in a similar way to the last line. If h5, black goes b4 and gets again his counterplay together quickly on the queen side after, for instance, a5, White takes on g6, let's say, brings his queen into the game, and then a4. This position is very unclear, and the bishop on d3 doesn't really help white in a position of this type. One last try for black, going back to h4, is a central break d5. A break on the flank deserves a break in the centre. If white goes knight takes c6 in this position, black goes b takes c6. And if knight a4, here we see yet another example of white having to change tack in the can. This time he's got to play on the queen side to get any advantage. Then I think rook b8 is an interesting move. And after bishop a7, rook b7, bishop c5, rook e8, again we see black developing counterplay with the help of moves such as knight d7. So going back to g6 now, we pick up Cutronius Davis again, with white having castled. And now the game follows familiar contours. White sets up his Maroczy bind, and black constructs a kind of hedgehog position. Flexible, adaptable, ready to react at a moment's notice. And white played f3. Alright, well he's probably wanting to go queen d2 without allowing knight g4. That's why he goes f3. But Davis spies an interesting opportunity now to gain counterplay in the centre with the move d5. I repeat, in hedgehog positions, the breaks d5 and b5 are moves black should be looking out for. And this is a golden opportunity, Davis thinks, to get that move in. Black is taking full advantage of the temporary unprotection of the bishop on e3. Cutronius took on d5, black recaptured, and white went queen d2. Of course, the point of black's whole play is that if white takes on d5 with his pawn, black's going knight b6, when he can regain the pawn in favourable circumstances. Going back to e takes d5, if white takes back with the knight on d5, again it's fairly simple. Knight takes d5, c takes d5, and now knight to b6 regains the pawn again, and black is absolutely fine in this position. So I think d5 is a well-timed move and probably equalises. So white went queen d2, and Davis missed no opportunity to liquidate in the centre and activate his knight. Alright, white retreated to b3, keeping the bishop active, and now black brought the timber off the back rank with bishop d7, rook fd1, rook c8. The c4 square is a bit loose, so probably black is threatening knight c4 in this position, which is why white moves his queen out of the way. Now it's a question of the black queen on the same file as the white rook. So again, Davis moves the queen out of the way, keeping his knight protected on e5. Safe, solid chess. White goes knight c2. There might be an idea of bishop b6. Davis sticks his knight in on c4, not only to force white to exchange bishop for knight, but also to give his queen a bit of room along the fifth rank. So bishop b6 being ineffectual in this position, white decides to go bishop d4. And now black improves the position of his bishop on d7. That bishop was slightly insecure on the d file. White was threatening bishop takes f6, and so Davis anchors the bishop. Knight comes to e3, rook comes to c6, another safe move. And basically in this position black is absolutely fine. You know, white has a few tricks based on his extra rook in the centre, but really black should be able to negotiate this position quite comfortably. Well, white went queen h5, intensifying the pressure against the knight, and now a slightly uncomfortable looking move g5, but a move which white has no real way to take advantage of. Black's queen is very well posted, and Davis now brought his last remaining piece into the game with rook to d8. Alright, knight f1, rook d7. Again, safety play, anchoring the rook, protected by the bishop. This is typical grandmasterly technique. You know, when they can't see what to do, they can't see a constructive way forward, they just make waiting moves, positive waiting moves, which improve their position slightly. Micro improvements, you might say. Alright, bishop comes back, attacking pawn. Pawn is defended, and white plays h4. Now black has to gain counterplay quickly. He plays g4. Rook takes on d7. Knight takes on d7. f4. And now the queen comes across to h5. Rook comes to d1. pawn to f5, bishop d4, and now bishop f8. Well, you know, you could view black's kingside pawn advances as weakening. You could also view them as gaining space. A weakness is not a weakness unless it can be taken advantage of. And it's hard to see how white is going to take advantage of black's weaknesses on the king side, if there are any. It may just be that black is absolutely fine still in this position. For instance, after knight e3, that's the best white could find. Black goes queen f7. And black has serious counterplay in this position with the two bishops, more space on the king side. If white plays g3 to defend his h-pawn, then of course he's inheriting serious weaknesses on the white squares around his king. And let's not forget, the white square bishop is the piece white doesn't possess. So, you know, white's got to be a bit careful in this position. He doesn't suddenly go down on the light squares. a3. All right, rook comes to d6. b4, and now knight comes to b8. Well, with knight c6 coming up, the Grandmaster from Greece decides it's time to bail out. You know, he can't quite see how he's going to take this position further. Knight c6 will just give black a very good position. White can't conquer the d5 square here because he hasn't got the firepower to do it, nor a light square bishop. So he just decides to liquidate. And bishop c5 is a common sense approach to the position. You know, white realises he's got nothing, it's about equal. It's time to bail out. Bishop g7 was played, and of course a natural equality results. Bishop c5, bishop g7, bishop d4, and agreed drawn. So a game which shows the solid nature of black's position. There's no guarantee your opponents are going to play as well as Cotronius, and a good illustration of how effective the central break d5, played at the right moment, can be. Well, the first game I would like to use to introduce the move 5c4 is a real heavyweight struggle from the Botvinnik Memorial in 2001. Playing white, none other than Garry Kasparov. Playing black, none other than Vladimir Kramnik. So we're going to be treated to a feast of excellent chess in this game. And perhaps it's slightly surprising to see Kasparov playing c4 after a6. Before this game, he had almost exclusively against the Can been playing 5 knight c3. So perhaps 5c4 was already an attempt to surprise Kramnik and force him away from his preparation. It's interesting for us, of course, to see how Kramnik responds. And in this particular game, he played what I think is the most accurate response. Knight out to f6, knight c3, and then queen to c7, which I think is the best way for black to play. It's the most flexible way, and black rejects immediate complications. Just going back a couple of moves, I should mention the trap, which is very common in all lines of the Sicilian, where black plays an early e6. e5, queen a5 check, and black nabs a pawn. Don't laugh, I have seen this happen at club level. But of course, not going to happen in Kasparov versus Kramnik. So, knight c3. Now, I should just take a little look at bishop b4, because this is an option which I know a lot of black players would like to play in this position. You can do this, but the position is very complicated after bishop d3, knight c6, knight takes c6, and now e5. And black basically has to go queen a5 in this position, and then we get incredible complications after e takes f6, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, queen takes c3 check, bishop d2, queen takes d3, f takes g7. This type of position is not everybody's cup of tea. You can do this. It will involve quite a bit of independent research if you want to play this position. But going back now to Kasparov versus Kramnik, I slightly prefer the move queen c7. It keeps all of black's options open, and it's highly thematic in terms of the can. Now, probably in this position, black is threatening bishop to b4, and that's why a3, which seems like an insignificant pawn move, has become the main line. And just to play back, you know, one more time, let's take a look at a few options. Well, you see, the thing is, if that plays a move like bishop e3 in this position, Now I think bishop b4 is rather good for black, who threatens the pawn on e4. Just going back to queen c7, if black plays bishop d3 in this position, then I wonder whether black can respond with knight to c6. And white is in a slight dilemma as to how he plays in this position. He doesn't want to retreat the knight, he doesn't want the knight exchanged, so what is he actually to do here? Probably knight c6 equalises. So that's why most white players, certainly at grandmaster level, settle for the move a3. It looks like the loss of time, but in fact later on white hopes to use this move to expand on the queen side. Anyway, Kramnik goes d6. There are other moves in this position. Black can go b6. He can go knight c6. He can even play the very interesting move here, knight takes e4. And the idea of this is that if white plays knight takes e4, black goes queen e5. And it's surprisingly difficult for white to defend his hanging knights in the centre. Probably best is bishop d3 and just sacrifice a pawn in this position. It's obvious that black is going to come under some pressure here. Again, this is not everybody's cup of tea. People who feel good about defence, who like to grab material and hang on to it, might be attracted by this continuation. But for me, the initiative that white has outweighs material considerations at this moment in time. And, well, I think I would be happy just to settle for d6 and go into some type of sort of hedgehog position, which is exactly what Kramnik does. Basically, the hedgehog is a setup where black develops on his first three ranks. He retains an enormous amount of counter-punching potential with his setup, and he makes it difficult for white to find targets in his position. The game continues as normal. Kasparov is just allowed this extra rank in space, whereas black just develops flexibly and awaits events. Alright, well, we see black developing in hedgehog style. The bishop comes to b7, attacking e4, so white defends it. Bishop e7 and both sides castle. And funnily enough, before this game, 2001, Kramnik had usually been quite happy to play these positions with white. So perhaps he just wanted to see how Kasparov would handle the white pieces in this position. You know, white's got perhaps a very small edge in this position, but it's not exactly the type of edge you could say is definite. I mean, you're not going to nurture this edge to victory. It's a very unclear position. White's got to be very accurate in the preparation of his advances on the flanks. You know, white's not going to get anywhere in this position unless he can crack black open using pawns. So white's got a decision to make now. Is he going to advance on the queen side, or is he going to advance on the king side? And black just awaits events for the time being, continues to develop, and keeps everything flexible. Well, king h1. Obviously, there are lots of things that white can do in this position. You know, an enormous number of moves. Black, I presume, would respond in roughly the same way. He just keeps moving the pieces out. Rook c8 is as flexible as it gets, and he's just waiting to see what white is going to do. At some point in this game, black is looking for breaking out with either b5 or d5. Those are the classical breaks in the hedgehog, which black is looking to play at the right moment. Of course, they are a long way off at the moment. Okay, white played b4, and with this move, Kasparov declares his intentions to cramp black on the queen side. You know, basically in this game, Kasparov demonstrates white's ideal plan. But still, black has fighting chances, and we'll see exactly how this is done. Black's queen drops out of the way. Perhaps the black queen was slightly uncomfortable on the same file as white's rook. But there's more to it than that, because bishop d8 is the further idea. Typical manoeuvre in this setup. Black's intending to put his bishop on c7, and then he can think about playing d5 with added effect. The point of d5, of course, especially in this position, is that the bishop on c7 and the queen on b8 battery would suddenly open up fire against h2. So white's got to be careful against this. Alright, rook c2. And now Kramnik continued in typical style with rook to e8. Now that, to me, although Kramnik plays it and one has to respect the move of such a great player, that to me looks slightly inconsistent. Going back, I just wonder why he didn't play bishop c7 in this position. Now White has certainly got to think about defending h2, so probably bishop g1 is the most flexible move. And now king h8, which is an idea which Bobby Fischer introduced back in 1970. Black's idea is to go rook g8, and then he opens up lines, or he tries to gain squares on the king side by playing g5, g4. Lots of strong players have used this idea. The Polgars liked it at one point. And, well, for me, that would be more consistent with the black setup. In fact, if White misplays this position and similar positions, Black can use this plan to get a very strong attack. And so it certainly would have been interesting to see how Kasparov dealt with that plan. That's certainly a plan to remember in these hedge-hog positions. This king in the corner, rook g8, g5, g4, and Black has very serious counterplay against White's king. But on that day, Kramnik thought that rook e8 was a good move, which of course it is. It's a very decent move. And now the onus is on Kasparov to prove the advantage. Okay, knight to a4 was played. And only now does Black go bishop c7. Bishop g1 as suggested earlier, protecting h2. And now rook c to d8. Another one of those flexible moves, you know, neither side is declaring the intentions. Black is just covering bases with this move. And White moves his rook across to b1. Alright, well there may be some idea of c5 for White. Black drops back further with bishop a8. Queen to c1. Patience is the key in a position of this type. A lot of strong players like the Black hedgehog setup because it's incredibly difficult to break down. And especially against impatient players, it tends to work very, very well. If White overplays his hand and attacks Black too early, then the position can blow up in White's face. So White has to be extremely patient. Kasparov knows this, of course. And so Queen c1, again, is a move which covers all bases and tries to introduce the of c5 into the position at the right moment. Alright, pawn up to h6. Again, flexibility personified. It may be that later on Black can get on with this plan of advancing on the king side with king h8, rook g8 and g5. Maybe h6 even tends to think about the move g5. But then again, I think probably Kramnik was just freeing up the back rank, trying to make as flexible a move as he can find. And he's kind of tempting White into going c5 in this position, when I think Black would have responded b5. It's perhaps slightly too early to go c5 in this position, and after c6, knight e5, this is obviously very unclear. The c6 pawn could well turn out to be weak. Therefore, going back to a6, this is why Kasparov plays another patient move, knight b2, improving the position of his pieces. That knight's doing nothing on a4, so Kasparov brings the knight back into the game. Alright, Kramnik continues to manoeuvre. Patience is the key. Both sides improving their position. The knight now comes to g6, eyeing up e5 and f4 squares. In general, in a position of this type, Black is eyeing the dark squares. And so therefore e5 and f4 are important components of any Black plan, any future Black plan. I should stress once again, Black is looking to break out with d5 or b5 in the hedgehog. And of course White is correspondingly trying to lock Black in and prevent him from playing such moves. This is chess at the highest level, so we can expect patience and accuracy. Alright, a4, continuing with the cramp. Queen c8. b5. After the game, just going back, Kasparov indicated that perhaps a5 was a better way to bring Black under pressure. And if Black takes that pawn, now b5 is a good move, securing a strong passed pawn. Black's extra pawn in this position is fairly meaningless. You know, what basically is going to happen is the queen side is going to open up and the white rooks are going to be exactly the right place. And there's even a tactical point involved. If Black plays bishop b6 in this position, knight takes e6 is a very useful discovery from White's point of view. Nevertheless, Kasparov went in for the tempting move b5, and now Kramnik played a5, blocking lines on the queen side. This is definitely not what black wants to happen here. Lines opening up free of charge, as it were. I mean, if black is going to allow open lines here, he wants to at least entice the white knight into c6, after which Kramnik took it off. Now just go back. Again, there was perhaps a tempting move here. We just dropped back one more move, excuse me, to a5 in e5, opening up the lines. Point of this move is that after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, white is intending either knight c6 or maybe even c5. Against knight c6, I think black goes bishop takes c6 and then e4 and gets counterplay. Okay, the white pieces are raining down on b6, but there's definite counterplay here for black. I suppose Kasparov felt that, well, he had the better position here, and therefore it was probably better to play knight c6 straight away. There was no need to give up an important central pawn in this position. Of course, black cannot allow that knight to stay on the board. And now, of course, Kramnik plays the best move here, pawn up to e5. Now, let's go back. I think if black had played knight e7 in this position, coming after the c-pawn, Kasparov would have revealed what the point of his whole idea was with e5. And if d takes e5, c5. This is a classic breakthrough on the queen side. Black has got to be very, very careful of in this whole variation. In a sense, this game is Kasparov displaying white's optimal plan. If black can survive this plan, then, you know, the whole system is in business. If he can't, then, you know, black ends up with a passive position. I've already shown, I hope, one way black could have avoided this mess by playing bishop c7 and king h8 earlier, and then playing up with rook g8 and g5. Of course, Kramnik doesn't want e5 to happen, so that's why he plays e5 himself. And, well, I don't know whether Kasparov saw this move or underestimated or what. He probably thought to himself, well, okay, I'll just take on 6 in this position and then have the better game. Well, it's true, it may be true that white is better, but again, it's not an easy advantage to realise because of the weakness of the c6 pawn. So, of course, Kramnik brings the knight around to take off this pawn. Alright, Kasparov tries to blast his way through. Kramnik's having none of it. He blocks the c-file. White brings to the 7th rank, and now he brings his rook up to the 5th rank. So Kasparov's putting on a little bit of pressure in this position, and it's up to black now to demonstrate some counterplay. The knight came back to g6, monitoring 5, observing h4 and f4. E takes d5 happened. Knight takes d5. And now white went knight f2. Now, white could have taken on a5 in position. I suppose against that, black would move forward with e4. That's the point of the black setup after all. F takes, rook takes, and bishop f3 looks for white. Now I think black will play rook takes a4. And if rook takes, queen takes c6. There's no doubt about it. White is certainly still a little bit better in this position. But for instance, after a move like knight c7, black retains defensive chances. And you know, black had counterplay based upon moves like knight h4. So I think this would have been very unclear, and perhaps this is why, going back to the game, Kasparov preferred knight f2. He didn't want to rush things and leave Kramnik with his weak a pawn. It really, the onus is on black to show equality. Knight gf4, good move. Now the queen has mobility along the 6th rank. I mean, maybe she's even thinking about coming across to g6. So that's why white goes bishop f1 to cover g2. Just going back once again, we have to look at moves like rook takes a5. I think after that, queen c7 will be played. And after rook b5, now black has the excellent move, knight c3. And this is the tactic upon which black is relying in this position. Of course, if rook takes 3, knight takes e2. Is a very unpleasant fork. Slightly surprising tactic, but it just shows you, in all these head-on positions, black is not without his chances. He's got to hang tough and look for the weak points in white's game. Knight e6, heading for d4. Finally, rook takes a5, queen c7, rook b5, and now the knight comes into d4. So if you are wondering about that continuation, we just have to drop back to rook takes a5, queen c7. If rook a6, black forks with knight b4. Queen e1, black has the interesting move knight e3 in this position, decoying the white queen away from the defence of the rook on a5. So rook b5 was forced, and now it's a different game after knight d4. Rook c4 was played, knight takes b5, takes b5. The pawns look very scary, you know, but Kramnik will show he has plenty of defensive resources in this position after rook b8. Well, it's moved 39. Time trouble was, I think, rearing its head, so Kasparov decides to go for it with the move b6. I don't know, this position is of course very unclear. A lot of players would just take fright at the thought of these pawns coming down the board towards them, but you know, Kramnik is basically a very strong player, and he says to Kasparov, well, you have to prove it. My own view of this position is that it's approximately equal. I mean, for instance, white, if he just plays a move like rook c2, keeping the tension, will be hard pressed to lose. But it'll be hard pressed to win as well, because it's difficult to advance these pawns further without having something similar to what happens in the game happen. Going back to rook b8, white could have chosen knight g4 with the idea that if rook b5, knight takes h6, and well, white is trying to blow black away in this position. I think king f8 is probably the most judicious move, and then knight f5. Again, very, very unclear, this position. Well, anyway, all these considerations, when time trouble is difficult to judge, you know, Kasparov decides to play the forcing continuation, and Kramnik whipped that pawn off. I've no doubt he whipped it off straight away. And so c takes b6, queen takes b6, and once again we reach an approximately equal position. Two minor pieces for rook and pawn, all the pawns on the same side. It looks balanced, you know. The game goes on for quite some time, but my impression probably is if the pawns can get rolling, and this is a very ambitious thought, then black might have a slight advantage in this position, because minor pieces require squares in the centre really to entrench themselves on, and so black's got to, if he wants to win, and I think that's unlikely, he's got to kind of deny white's minor pieces squares in the centre, at the same time advancing his pawns. I mean, it's a kind of conjuring act, which is probably not going to come off, you know, with best play. So I think it's roughly equal, but nevertheless it's still quite an interesting position. So queen e1, of course white has to defend his knight, and now, correctly, I think, black exchanges off a pair of rooks. Okay, knight g4, rook e8, and now white plays bishop d3, which probably, funnily enough, is a mistake. I think white should probably give a little bit of air to his king in this position with h3. And after bishop d3, Kramnik is on this like a shot, of course, with queen to d4. Bishop e4 happened. If queen e4 in this position, queen a1, bishop b1, and now rook d8 demonstrates why white should have played h3 all those moves ago and freed up his back rank. No, after bishop e4, Kasparov have missed the move f5, and it's a very surprising move. Obviously white's got to take, and now comes rook a8, and this is suddenly slightly uncomfortable with black coming into a1 and white having to go into a self-pin. So the game actually flares up again. Bishop b1 was played, queen b2, the knight is a long way off in this position, white's threatened with rook a1, h4 was played, rook a1. Kasparov was probably thinking to himself, well, how the heck did I get into this mess? Because it just shows you how disjointed the two minor pieces can get in positions of this, especially when you've got a weak back rank. So king h2 was played, queen takes b1, queen takes e5, queen takes queen h1 check, king g3, queen e1, and now the queens come off Well, now it's a question of whether black can win this endgame. There was a very similar endgame in the Vidmar Alekhine San Remo 1930, and in that particular game, Alekhine won this type of position with black. My own feeling is probably this is a draw with best defence, but it's not as easy as it looks. There's a tendency to think, oh, this must be a draw, knight and all of the pawns on the same side, white's got an extra pawn, but it's not that easy because of the lack of mobility of the knight. At any rate, let's see how Kramnik builds up the pressure. Well, the play goes on as we thought it might. Basically, white's trying to defend actively. With g6 tries to keep the knight out of f5. White's happy to try to exchange as many pawns as he can, and correspondingly, black wants to keep the pawns on. So that's why Kramnik plays g5. I think taking on a5 just leads immediately to a draw after, for instance, g takes h5, rook h2, and then king g4, and the knight's coming into f5. So white wants the pawns off, black keeps them on. Okay, king e4, only move. King e6, and now white goes for the exchange of pawns. Alright, very good move now. Rook f2. And white is struggling because the f4 square is weak in this position. You don't want the rook appearing on f4 in this position, because then after that black could start to make some very serious progress, making some inroads with his king, and white is all tied up. Note that if white exchanges pawns on g5, there's no target for white to aim at on h6. White's looking to play knight f5 to gain some counterplay, but if he takes on g5, there's no longer any pawn to aim at. So that's why knight d5 was played. I mean, maybe after rook f2, white could have considered f5, but then of course he can't occupy that square with his knight. Thus, after king d6, again, we see a position where, surprisingly, out of nowhere, white is coming under serious pressure because of black's threat of rook f4 check, and of course making gradual inroads with the king. So white goes knight d5. Black takes on f4. White takes back with the knight. King comes to f6. King comes back to e3, and now the black moves away from the action, out of harm's way of any forks. Alright, knight d3, and now the classical way of playing this type of ending, pinning the knight to tie the knight down. Now, Igor Stoll gave king g5 as better. I mean, that was definitely the move which I thought black should be playing when I first saw this game. After that, white probably plays knight e5. Now comes rook a6, defending against the threat of knight f7 check. King f3, and now rook e6. And surprisingly, once again, white is in a bit of a mess here. His pieces are coordinated. If he goes knight f7, black goes king h4, that doesn't change anything. If he goes knight c4, that is drifting away from the action. And black's rook, curiously, is in perfect position here with rook e1. White tries to keep a tight defence, but black can gradually make progress, very surprisingly, in this position. And we are. The king makes inroads, and the point of this move is that after knight f5, rook a6, we get a zugzwang position. And it's this type of zugzwang position that white has to be extremely careful of. Anyway, it just shows you, even at the highest level of world chess, these endgames, there are some still grey areas which even the greatest players have to learn from. And rook a3, whilst a natural move, maybe is not best. Black should have played king g5. Anyway, white plays king e4. He doesn't want to be in that pin for very long. And now I think, again, black should play g5. And then what we'll probably get is transposition to the other note. There will be some to-ing throwing. And rook e1 will transpose to the variation just shown. But after king e4, Kramnik played rook a1. King comes to f4. Of course, what you've got to remember is these endgames are, these days, often played at high speed. And so the two players, are relying on instinct and previous knowledge rather than any great analysis at length over the board. So rook f3, rook a4 check was played, king f3, rook a3 pinning, king e4, and for the third time in this game, black misses king g5, or actually doesn't play it, which is a very surprising turn of events. Kramnik played rook b3. My instinct tells me that Kramnik was short of time here. Otherwise, it's very hard to explain why king g5 isn't played. All right, rook b3, knight c5. Maybe he thought it didn't change anything. Maybe he thought he could play this continuation when he wanted to. He's just trying to torture Kasparov. So, I mean, it's perfectly possible that this is the case. Anyway, rook b4 check, king f3, rook b5, knight e4. Now the king cannot get to g5. And now I think an excellent move by Kasparov, and definitely a move which Kramnik missed. A brilliant move in many ways. g5. And I've absolutely no doubt at all that Kasparov thought, well, I'm going to play rook b3 check against this, aren't I? And then take the knight. Yeah, you can do that, but the problem with this continuation is the amazing move g takes h6. And it turns out that after king e5, h7, rook b8, king g5, white scrapes a miracle draw. Undoubtedly, Kasparov missed this continuation. Excuse me, Kramnik missed this continuation. It's a real surprise, actually. So just going back, knight e4, king e5, g5, brilliant move. Kramnik went rook b4. Knight f2 was played. Another excellent move, threatening knight d3 check. After rook f4, king g3. Regretfully, Kasparov had to agree to draw, because of course if he goes... Kramnik had to agree to a draw. I keep on saying Kasparov, I don't know why. Kramnik had to agree to a draw, because of course h takes g5, knight d3 check, king f5, knight takes f4, g takes f4, king f3 is just a complete draw. After king g3, what else does black have? Suddenly the white pieces are close by, and threat of the fork saved the day. So a titanic struggle there between two of the greatest players of all time. I hope you enjoyed it. Plenty of resources for black in the hedgehog system against c4, and we'll move on to looking at another game now where the hedgehog system crops up. Funnily enough, game 2 involving the move 5c4 features Garry Kasparov with black. It's a decade earlier, it's Linares 1991, and he's facing Jan Elvest, who at the time was one of the strongest players in the world. And Elvis played straight into the line we just saw, knight c3, queen c7, but instead of a3, he played his bishop out to d3. Well, against that, black has two ways. I already recommended knight c6, and then if white wants anything in this position, he's probably got to keep the knights on. There's no ideal way for white after knight c6. And then I think black's works up very interesting counterplay by just playing bishop out to c5 and the knight into e5. Of course, it's not a great bishop, the one on d3, so black should be in no rush to take it off. And, well, I don't know, how about the recommendation of suating, where black bides his time, he takes off the bishop, now he brings the other knight to e5. This is one way to play for black. Going back to Elvis Kasparov, after bishop d3, Kasparov settled for bishop e7, and this just went straight back into a kind of hedgehog stroke Scandinavian position, relying on the natural flexibility and solidity of black's position to furnish him with excellent counterplay. Well, okay, in this particular line, where white has, I don't know, slightly delayed his action because, of course, he's taken time to c4, I think knight c6 is without doubt the right response. It puts white in a slight quandary as to how he tackles the problem of this knight on d4. Of course, white could take on c6 in this position. Black will probably then recapture with the pawn. All bases are covered. Black's plan will probably be knight d7, knight c5, and then pawn up to a5. And I think this position is roughly equal. Another interesting plan for black funnily enough, in this position, it's a bit long-winded, but it's perfectly practicable, is to play the knight back to d7, pawn up to c5, knight comes back to b8, knight c6, and then finally, knight hops into d4. White's got to be a bit wary of the fact that he has exposed d4 in this position. So, going back to knight c6, weighing everything up, Elvis decided to keep the knights on. And now black plays knight d7. It's a kind of scorched earth policy, that. Getting out of the way and preventing, well, dissuading white from playing e5, which is his natural break here. And slightly surprisingly, Elvis decided to play a3. Well, he could have castled, of course. I have no doubt at all Kasparov was going to play bishop f6 then, and after bishop d2, queen b6. And after king h1, I wonder whether black come in and take that pawn off. So Elvis decides to delay any sort of definitive action, and after a3, bishop f6, played his bishop out to e3. My own view is probably white should have played bishop d2 in this position, preventing black's next move. But even there, after knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, it's evident that black has a very comfortable game. Okay, he's operating on one rank less, but he's managed to exchange off a pair of pieces, which is very logical. He's got the d4 square under control, and white's Maroczy bind isn't really restricting any of black's pieces in this position. You know, black can play b6, bishop b7, castles, rook c8, and really there's no cramp at all. So, well, I think Kasparov's way of playing has demonstrated that black has plenty of resources. Just get out of the way with them and play on the dark squares in the centre. At any rate, now, after bishop e3, black has the chance to take on c3, a chance he takes with both open arms, and then he shuts up shop on the dark squares with e5. And now I think this position is starting to look very good for black already. 5. White presses on the king side. If white castles in this position, then I think black takes and strong points e5. And black certainly has slightly the better game. The bishop on d3 is ridiculous, and the pawn on c4 is not long for this world. So, I mean, maybe white can work up some tactical chances here, but strategically and positionally, black is weak. That's why Elvis pushes on with f5. And now Kasparov plays a very good move. Knight cb8. Truly grandmasterly move. And the point of this is he wants to put a knight on c5. If he played the knight to c5 straight away, white would probably take it off. Of course, black would want to recapture with the queen in such a position to keep pressure on c4. You know, and after d takes castles. Okay, I mean, white may be a little bit worse in this position. But white could have a long-term plan of putting a knight on d5. How possible is that? Well, very possible. I mean, he can go, for instance, rook d1, knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, and then the knight reaches its destination. Okay, it's a bit long-winded, but why give white that option? And so Kasparov decides to take that option completely away from Elvis and play knight cb8, and white castles knight c5. Now, of course, it's much better for black than before, because when white takes on c5, black's going to take back with the queen. Elvis retreated with bishop c2, knight bd7, rook fd1, and now another point to Kasparov's excellent knight manoeuvre, knight to f6, not only attacking e4, but defending the weak point at d5, should that be even necessary. Well, white plays knight d2. As stated, white's got this long-winded plan of getting the knight into d5, so this is one step on the ladder. But the main point of that, of course, is just to defend e4. Bishop d7, bringing another piece round to attack e4. Yes, white can take on f6 in this position, but that's not a very good trade. When you're trading things off, it's important to remember what's left on the board. And I can see a white square bishop for white, which is only going to cause him a lot of pain and suffering. So Elvis, of course, doesn't do that. And now Cast shows the complete flexibility in black's position. Kasparov didn't commit himself to anything. He manoeuvred very accurately, and now he's got all the pressure in this position. Yes, white will have some counterplay on the B and D files, but positionally, black has a much better game. Better bishop, better knights, safer king. Rook e1. H6 forcing the issue. White's not interested in surrendering that bishop. And now black makes the first steps towards levering open the king side, which is his basic plan in this position, I think. White is not going to be able to have any rest here. Kasparov's plan is to play g5 and h5 as quickly as he can, and so as a prelude to that idea, he just gets the knight out of the way. Knight f1, the manoeuvre spoke of earlier, and now pawn up to g5. And a lot of players would take on g6 in this position, and a lot of players would be mistaken, because that would be opening up lines on the king side, which is exactly where black wants to play. So if white's going to have any chance of surviving this attack, he's got to keep lines closed, which is why Elvis just retreats the bishop. Anyway, Kasparov gets on with it. I mean, this is just easy to understand play. H4 taking away squares, and now the knight comes back to its rightful place in this position on f6. Bishop takes c5. The pressure was building. I mean, black had 3 pieces on e4. He had pressure all over the board. I don't think white would have done this had he not been able to play knight e3 on the next move. But Kasparov shows that despite white's idea of knight d5, he still can't keep equality in this position. And queen a5 hits the pawn on c3. Queen b2 was played, and now h3, stretching white all over the board. The principle of several weaknesses in the position. White can maybe defend 1 or even 2 weaknesses. He can't ultimately defend both his king, e4, and c3 and c4. It's just not possible. And h3, of course, now levers open the long diagonal for the crushing move. Knight takes e4. And this is game over. An important pawn goes next to the king. Rook comes to d8. White is not even able to manoeuvre knight into d5 in this position. And black is easily able to repel the threats. So the knight was threatening f7. Queen comes back. Queen goes to f2. And now bishop e6 again, defending against all the threats. Rook comes to b1, what else? And now Kasparov coordinates his position nicely by doubling his rooks. Okay, well, the first point to note is, well, white played rook be2. The first point to note is that if white goes rook e b1 in this position, rook e1 check wins. Back rank problems abound. So that's why, being unable to press the b file, Elvis has to play a rather moribund move, rook be2. And now black just consolidates. f6, knight g6, bishop takes c4. And, well, there's nothing for it other than to resign. Time control reached, move 40, Elvis resigns. 2 pawns down for nothing, facing the firing squad against Garry Kasparov. Forget it. So, a one-sided game, but it just shows you that perhaps bishop d3 on move 7 is not the most accurate move. And with a well-timed knight c6, black gets a very good position. My third game with c4 comes from the Ghent Open in the year 2000. It's between a guy called Rudy van Wessel playing with white, and he's playing against Vladimir Chuchelov, graded 2535. And black's playing this game makes chess look easy. And it features again this move bishop d3, after which black played knight to c6. We know this is the right response, and white retreats the knight to f3. Alright, Chuchelov plays bishop e7 and sets up the traditional hand setup on 3 ranks. Kind of a normal hedgehog position, except that the knight's on c6 in this position. The knight would normally be on d7, but then of course white has been forced to make a small concession by retreating his own knight to f3. So without the move f4, the white position loses a certain punch, and therefore white's got to kind of handle the position in a different way and just rely on piece play to furnish any sort of an advantage. Well, Chuchelov shows that in such a situation black's position is very, very playable, and in fact, could quite often rebound in white's face. The problem for white in this position is the uncomfortable situation of the bishop on d3 vis-a-vis the pawn on c4. You would normally think the Maroczy bind entitles white to some sort of small edge because black is cramped on 3 ranks. Well, in this game, black shows that it is possible to manoeuvre successfully on those 3 ranks and get a very good position. Now comes knight e5. Okay, well, the point of that move is that black is thinking about nabbing the bishop on h4. The idea is perhaps black wants to retreat to g6, and when white goes bishop g3, black will bring a knight across to h5 and simply take the bishop off. After that, there there comes a sort of patient exploitation of the two bishops. Of course, white can take on e5 in this position, but then he has to worry about our old friend the d4 square, and the bishop on h4 looks slightly stranded in this position. So probably bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Now at least a black knight can't get to d4, and after b4, bishop g5, rook 2, rook fd8. After c5, black can play rook d4 with counterplay. We see it often in this line, the use of the d4 square. This position I judge to be slightly better for black. So going back to the move knight e5, white settled for the quiet move b3, and black went straight through with this plan of nabbing the dark square bishop. And this idea immediately gives black a very, very comfortable game. He's got to be watchful initially, defending his weak points, but the bishop on e7 in this position has considerable potential. Right, knight e5, bishop b1. Black's got a little of reorganisation to do before he can go active, and the first stage in the plan is to station the bishop on the long diagonal, which is exactly what Shalov does. Funnily enough, now we're getting to a position that is just like a hedgehog, where white hasn't got a dark square bishop. Without this bishop, it seems unlikely that he's going to be able to break through. But nevertheless, this is exactly what Van Wessel tries to do. This is a good example of what can happen in this system when white goes into overambitious mode. I mean, I don't think his position justifies a move like f5. I mean, he could try queen h3. When he goes to overambitious mode and gets blasted, once again, I think black can just take on f5 and block with g5. As happens in the game, white goes f5, and black's able to play his knight into a very comfortable square and just defend economically with queen e7. And now the bishop on b is starting to look very sick. Another common theme in this line, the laming of white's light square bishop. Alright, knight e2, he can't think of what to do, so he's planning on bringing his knight to f4. h5, an excellent move. Black is thinking about playing knight g4, after which white has serious problems on f2 and e3. Rook f1 defending, e takes f5, opening up fire for the queen and the rook on e7 and e8 respectively, and now brings the queen into the game, commencing operations on the dark squares. Black is very strong on the dark squares in this position, so it makes sense to operate on those colour squares. And now Van Wessel goes knight f4. Well, I know I would certainly have considered taking on g6. At least that brings the bishop on b1 and the rook on f1 immediately into the game. But I think black, after f takes e6, knight e6, queen 7, knight takes g7, king takes g7, knight f4, is surviving with interest after bishop c8. And white has definite problems in this position. If he goes queen h4, well, he runs into moves such as knight g4, and black has pressure all over the board. If he goes queen h2, bishop g4, knight d5, queen g5, to a certain extent locks the white queen in, and black is looking forward now to rook f8 and taking over the position. However, in the game, white went knight f4, went queen g4, white went queen h2. If white swaps, knight comes into g4, threats on e3 and d4. White doesn't like that, but well, black has a very good game here. He's got a very active position. White isn't really doing very much, and black is gradually taking over. A knight d e6, the best chance. Rook f6, knight takes g7, king takes g7, bishop e4. Well, could be a mistake. I mean, you could try bishop takes 6 in this position. Tactical idea based on rook e7 check. After that, I think rook takes f4 is strong. G takes 4, knight g6, and if f5, knight e5. Well, rook takes e5 in this position isn't working in view of the simple capture. So rook d1, rook f8, and black is in the ascendancy. Going back to the game, bishop e4 was played, but I think this is probably a mistake. Bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and then excellent move g5, which I'm sure Van Wessel overlooked. And the point of this move is not immediately obvious. Knight takes h5 looks like a winning shot, right? But now black has the fantastic move. Queen takes, rook takes f1, king h2, and now rook h8. So a nice little combination there, after which black emerges a piece up. So g5 is probably winning. Queen g1. As reluctant to move as you're ever likely to find on the chessboard. G takes f4, queen takes b6, rook cf8 coordinating, and white decided to resign. So once the dark square bishop had gone, Chuchilov managed to make black's position looks very good indeed, and an effortless victory for him. I'm not going to leave the section on 5c4 without demonstrating an example of the way black can generate an attack on the king side using the Fischer plan with rook g8 and g5. So my final game comes from the Russian Women's Championship in 2004 between Alisa Galiamova, graded 2502, and Tatiana Kosintseva, graded 2451. The actual move order in this game is not a can. It's a rather unusual move order, where black plays d6 and a6 early. This is very unusual. Normally black will play knight f6 on move 4 to force white to play knight c3 to stop the Moxie bind. Well, here it seems as though black is actually encouraging white to play Moxie bind, and so we conveniently get a transposition back into a kind of can. Well, in fact, it's exactly the same move order as Kasparov-Kramnik ultimately, where both sides are developing their pieces. Here we have the classic hedgehog setup. Rook into c1, pawn up to a3, queen up to c7, and now this transposition back to Kasparov-Kramnik, where white is expanding on the queen side, black is going into a little huddle, and now she goes through with her manoeuvre, bishop d8, king h1, and now bishop c7, opening up fire against h2. The hedgehog is so elastic that you can almost play this plan against virtually any white setup that he cares to adopt. It is extremely flexible and extremely adaptable, and now white's got to find a way through. I imagine this type of idea will be extremely successful at club level, because club players will tend to, in my view, flounder in these positions with white. You know, they set up their Moxie bind, they get their small edge, but it's a kind of baffling small edge because all the pieces are on the board, lots of complications. The player who knows the plans better is going to win. Basically, white's got to force through c5 in this position if he wants to get any sort of advantage. Black's got to lever open the game on the king side or play d5 and b5. So knowledge of these plans is very important, and certainly knowledge of this attacking plan with king h8 will serve you in very good stead, I think. So anyway, black is leading up to rook g8 and g5. So white starts the preparations for c5. So far, so good. Black sees c5 coming up, steps out of the way with queen, and now white goes into what we call fiddle mode. I don't think she can see exactly what to do, so she starts fiddling around for a little while. I mean, probably white should just plough through with c5 anyway and see what happens after that. But this fiddling around leads nowhere. White seems to be wanting to put every single piece she's got on c5 before she actually plays it. Meanwhile, black plays bishop c6, which is a good move, provoking white to play b5, which is of course a move she doesn't want to make, so the knight goes back. And now, the knight having left the scene of the crime, black can get on with the job with g5. And this is black's essential plan in this position, to lever open the king side using g4. Now you might say, well hang on, isn't black's king going to be rather insecure in a position of this type? Well, not necessarily. I mean, black's king is very safe, and white doesn't want the long diagonal opening up. So he's basically got to keep those pawns on e4 and f3 as they are. Judge for yourself. I mean, white plays knight d4. I mean, she's a 2500 player, and she's struggling with this position. And now white looked around the position. She probably thought to herself, well, hang on, I can't play c5. Black is going to play a move like rook g6 here, or knight e5. And how am I going to get counterplay against this setup? You know, black seems to have all the chances. So she took on g4. Well, of course, that can't be a very good move, because e4 is weakened. So we're waiting to see what white's intention is after knight takes g4. Evidently, it was queen c3. Now black calls white's bluff and plays the amazing move, bishop takes e4, and allowing a discovered check. And the point of this move is, of course, that if white goes in for, say, knight takes e6 in this position, Black has a simple move, bishop f6, and if bishop d4, we just take on e6 in this position, and g2 is hanging. White's entire king position is in mortal danger. So after bishop takes e4, it may well be that White's already gone wrong, and Black is doing rather well. So bishop f3 was played. Well, that doesn't solve anything. Black plays bishop f6, neutralising the pressure on the diagonal. Black has successfully levered open lines against the white king. Up comes the knight to e5. The dark squares are a second to Black's advantage. There's an exchange on e4, and White tries rook e1, and now Black plays queen 6. It's amazing how quickly the Black attack appeared in this game. And now White's still fiddling around on the queen side. I don't know what she thinks she's up over there, but really she's not achieving anything at all. And this allows Black to power in with the idea of bishop e3. And the point of this is that the rook on c2 is hanging after a couple of captures. So White's in this position. She tries bishop, rook f1, bishop's come off, knight comes into e3, a crushing fork, queen c3, queen takes c2, and it's amazing, White never got around to playing her main idea in this position, which was c5. And it's this inconsistency you will find at club level. You're going to find you are pressing ahead with your kingside attack, and the opponent won't have the faintest idea what to do about it. That is my assessment of the scenario that will happen at lower levels when you play Fischer's attacking plan. And as we've seen, even 2500 players fail to cope with what Black is actually doing here. So the rest of the game is a bit of a mop-up. White tries a few things, but really there's no chance here with her pieces all pinned up. And now knight b2 is another very attractive stroke to finish. And basically there's no defence whatsoever here. White's pieces are completely overloaded. Knight takes b2. Rook c1, thank you very much. So I think you may try this plan of attacking on the king side with confidence. You know, I don't see why not. And I think it will score very well for you. So just going back and to summarise, let's get the actual can move order here. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, a6, and now c4. I recommend that Black meets c4 with knight f6, knight c3, and now the flexible move queen c7, maintaining all options. You can get a satisfactory hedge-off position by these means and hope to beat off any white attack. Meanwhile, Roxy bind has not shown itself to be especially effective in this case.